Hey everybody, welcome to part two of the vowels section of these lectures. I hope you've been having a great week and that online classes haven't been too difficult so far, but we're getting back in the swing of things. I know I've been having a lot of nice long walks with my dogs and hanging out online with some of my friends, so it's been really good. No, but social distancing is very important. Anyway, um, I want to get talking about vowels. I just wanted to go over the questions that we're going to have today. I didn't have them pulled up. That was bad. Okay, so there's going to be two questions. The first one is, what is absolute spectral tone color? And please make sure you're not just like copying the information that's on the slides and like give me some good depth to what we're talking about. The next one is, what is a total vowel percept and what four factors go into creating it? Okay, so that's talking about what the total vowel percept is. I really want you to talk about it in your own words and not just copy, not just say it's the vowel sound and these are the different things. Talk to me about how they interact and how they create what's happening. All right, so now there are two parts, two ways that we like to define vowels. Okay, the first one is the curve of the spectrum. So that's talking about the source filter theory and how we interpret that. And the next one is the absolute spectral tone color, which is the inherent timbre in the frequency of a sine wave that we're hearing. And so we're going to talk about both of these. So first, talking about the curve of the spectrum. The curve of the spectrum deals with how the peaks in the filter, so remember we had the glottis that was opening and closing, cutting off the air, creating the rarefaction, and the pressure difference between the rarefaction and the compression creates the sound wave that perpetuates through the medium, right? Then the filter, which was the space of in our mouths and our vocal tracts, then has resonant properties that change the acoustic sound wave that's created by the airflow in the glottis. So then we get that filtered curve of the spectrum, right, that we've seen after we had the source filter theory that we talked about last time. So the curve of the spectrum here is relating to the critical bands and bark, right? So I write peaks in the spectrum correspond with critical bandwidths of hearing, meaning that our critical bandwidths are activated by the peaks in the spectrum, and then we use those peaks to figure out what vowel we're hearing. And that's dependent on the critical bandwidths. It's really important to know that this curve of the spectrum idea is really important to linguistics, who mostly deal with speech vowel perception, right? So it's when I'm talking, I'm usually low in my range in my mode 1 phonation, which is rich in harmonics that fill up all of those resonance frequencies that allow me to have a lot of information to figure out where those are. It's not quite the same for singing, as we'll see in a second. So the distance in bark or critical bands between these peaks is what determines the vowel. So 3 bark or so will be an ah. We'll hear it as an ah. Whereas like 11 bark, which is much wider, we will hear as an e vowel. So what's most important about this is what allows us to hear the same vowel between different speakers, because bark width is a relationship and not a set frequency. And what I mean by that is that we don't need to have a spectral peak at 800 hertz and then 1500 hertz in order to hear a specific vowel. We need to have the relationship of the number of critical bandwidths that those peaks take up, right? Their width of them. And so if we have like 3 or 11, we'll hear different vowels. And that's how we can have peaks at different places in the acoustic spectrum and still hear the same vowel. So then we have this idea of the spectral center of gravity, which is really important when we talk about the singer's formant. But basically, two formants that are close together within like 3 or 3.5 bark will end up morphing into one formant. So we won't be able to resolve the differences between those. They won't have a good resolution in our hearing. So the vowel ah and aw are really difficult to tell apart. I don't know about you, but when I was in English diction class as an undergrad and even a graduate student, it was really hard for me to hear the difference between those two. Part of the reason for that is because they're 3.5 bark apart. And so they're right on the edge of where this spectral center of gravity takes over and they end up being perceived as one resonance. And that is a little bit like weak tone color bridging, which we're going to talk about in a second. And so, as I said, this is really important to linguistics, and this is actually the predominant theory about how vowel perception works in terms of linguistics. But obviously, it doesn't work when we're singing, because when we're singing really, really high frequencies, you know, anything that's on the treble clef or a little bit above that, um, we are above the first resonance of the vocal tract, meaning that we have the second resonance of the vocal tract and then whatever else happens above that, but we're still hearing vowels as ah, even though they don't necessarily have that relationship. So, while this works really well for speech and linguistics, we have to talk about this other concept of absolute spectral tone color in terms of singing in order to understand what we're doing. So absolute spectral tone color is the idea that a specific frequency has a timbre in and of itself. So if you remember from our friend Reiner Plomp, his definition of timbre was whatever is not frequency, duration, and amplitude, right? But with this, we can know that that's not quite the case, that timbre is a little bit dependent on frequency. And we saw that when we were looking at some of the psychoacoustic stuff where you would have like a louder amplitude and it would feel like it went up in pitch when it was the same frequency, or that sound that takes up a wider bandwidth will sound louder to us than one that's more focused and still has a higher amplitude. So there's a little bit more gray area than we'd like to believe as scientists. So for absolute spectral tone color, generally these aren't the same for everyone because everybody hears a little bit differently. So this is a general guidelines. And the reason we use the approximately squiggly line is so because it sounds like these vowels to us. So a C or below will sound like an oo, and a C sharp to an F sharp will sound like an O. A G to a B is something like aw, and C to F sharp is dark aw to ah to bright ah, and then a, e, and so forth. And that's where we hear our spectral tone colors. All right, so now let's talk about how this works in this program called MADA. So MADA is a program that you can only get on PC, but you can download it for free, actually. And what we're just using right now is we're going to use it to create a sine wave, okay? And we're going to start that sine wave at middle C. So when I play my middle C, you're going to hear it as an oo color, and it will progress higher and higher and change timbral colors as it increases in frequency. So let's give that a listen. So it sounds very ooish to me right now. Still very oo. And now I'm going to start being on the cusp of changing to O. Now changing to aw. And now changing to dark ah. To bright ah. To a. Going towards E. All right. So I hope you didn't have to change your speaker volume too much while you're doing that. But you can definitely hear the change in the timbre that's frequency dependent on those pitches. So we hear vowels in those sine waves, and that's why we call it absolute spectral tone color, because it has the simple component of the sine waves. So probably you guessed it, that like this ends up being the building block into how we're going to build bigger vowel composites as we talk about things moving forward. So this is just talking about the different sign. We talked about this already, but essentially, the new information on the slide is talking about how these vowel colors follow the second formant path, right? So remember that oo, o, ah, a, e is the increasing of the second formant, and that's partially why we call it the vowel formant. Okay. So now I want to look in Voce Vista and see these different. We're going to look at some white noise, and as you know, white noise takes up the broad band of the acoustic spectrum, so it has acoustic energy everywhere at the same time. But what we're going to do is we're going to use the filters in Voce Vista to parse out little sections of it, and then hear what those different colors are. Okay. So I'll add my frequency filter. And down here, if I play this section of sound, it's going to sound like ooh. Then if I move that section of sound up, I can go all the way up to here actually and hear ooh. You might be able to hear it a little bit better if I do this. Yeah. Ooh. There. Nice strong ooh. Then we're going to move our filter over here. And we're going to hear ah now. And then move our filter even higher, and we will hear E. And as you can see, I created this graphic that gets in Voce Vista, but I essentially color-coded the different vowel sounds that we've got in the absolute spectral tone color graph. And you can equate that with the frequencies above, right? So if I move my frequency to the left and I put it above the green, it's going to sound like ah. And if I move it over the violet color here, it's going to sound like aw. Pretty cool, huh? All right. So now we're going to start talking about the four concepts. As soon as we start taking these colors and combining them, or how we get them combined, is what we're concerned with in the next section. So we're going to talk about how we create the total vowel percept, or what we compositely hear across the whole spectrum with these four parts. And those four parts are the multiple missing fundamental, local spectral coherence, weak tone color bridging, and the obvious true fundamental. So I remember when I read these terms seemed a little convoluted at first, but they're actually really descriptive, and it's really helpful to know all of them all the way through. So let's look at each one of them in turn. So before we get to the multiple missing fundamentals, we have to talk about what a missing fundamental is first. So we talked about this earlier in the semester, but a missing fundamental is basically the harmonics created. We can take out the bottom harmonic or the fundamental tone, and we will still perceive that tone because of the harmonics above them. So as I write here, if the fundamental oscillation is removed, but harmonics 2 through 8, or a majority of them, exist, we still perceive that fundamental even though it isn't there. So it's important to know that harmonics 2 through 8 are generally where our critical bands will resolve those frequencies still. The harmonics that occur above that start going into the parts of roughness that we talked about earlier. And so when they're rough and they start being unresolved, we don't contribute those to this missing fundamental idea because it just sounds like psh a little bit to us. Okay. So, and what's cool about the missing fundamental is it's used all over the place in our real life interactions with audio stuff. We just don't know about it, right? So in MP3s and the way that they get bass through our earbuds. So when you listen to your earbuds or you got those Dre Beats things or whatever and you're working out and you got like really good bass, those speakers can't actually create those frequencies that low. And so MP3s really take advantage of this thing called the missing fundamental, and they sort of beef up the harmonics that are above those bass notes to make you perceive that that bass note is actually being created by the speakers, whereas in real life it's not. And this also happens through telephones and Skype. So we've been doing this for 100 years or so. In a telephone signal, usually we've got about 300 hertz to 3000 hertz of frequency, and then the rest of it is cut off because you don't need that information to get spoken word through, right? However, the human ear hears up to 20,000 hertz, so there's a lot of information there that we cut off. Between those 300 and 3000 hertz, we get those 8 harmonics that we can resolve and perceive the vowel really easily, and we also get a lot of the qualities that happen for everybody's different personal voices, so you can really identify who you're talking to. Also, since we're teaching a lot of this online right now, it's important to know that our online tools like Skype and Zoom and FaceTime or Google Hangouts and all those things, they actually cut down the information in the sound waves and they compress it into a smaller file size. Because the smaller file size is easier to transmit over the internet, right? It takes up less bandwidth, so it means it can happen faster, and we get essentially the same information, right? However, if you're teaching lessons online, you really want to make sure that you're avoiding those sort of kinds of compression that have a lot of loss in the energy, because we're losing a lot of information that we could be talking about our students with. So Zoom is actually the best one to use in terms of that, because you can actually change a lot of the internal settings to make it a little bit easier to hear. Additionally, microphones will cut off certain frequencies and they won't be able to hear them. For instance, this microphone that I'm using right now only goes up until about 10,000 hertz. So if I was singing, there would be a lot of acoustic energy above that you wouldn't necessarily pick up with this microphone, as good as it might sound right now. It's not very true to what's happening in real life. All right. So then let's just look at that really quick to see what the missing fundamental looks like. So over here, I created this part in Voce Vista, and it's just 4 harmonics, right? And we've got a filter here, and what I'm going to do is just play all 4 of them, and we'll be able to hear this pitch down here as the fundamental. Let's adjust that a little bit. Definitely da, right. If we take away that bottom fundamental and only have these 3, we will still hear da as the pitch, because we will perceive it that way, even though there is no acoustic energy there. Da. Definitely hearing that. Let's add it back in and take it away. And back in and away. So that's what the missing fundamental is. I think it's fascinating. Our ears play so many tricks on us, right? It's just like our eyes and those those 3D picture games and all that stuff. It's our ears do the same thing. That's really a lot of what we're learning about in this class right now. So now we want to talk about what happens when we have multiple missing fundamentals like that. So I think you could probably tell pretty easily where this is going to go. But when we have harmonics, they're always going to resolve into a fundamental, right? And that fundamental is going to have a tone color in regards to the absolute spectral tone color graph. Then we can hear different tone colors depending upon what we're hearing as the fundamental. So, when we have enough of them, 3 or 4, usually, we still perceive that fundamental. And so where those 3 to 4 harmonics are, adopt the spectral tone color of the range of the acoustic spectrum, which matches their missing fundamental. So even if the oo color is really strong, has a really strong harmonic down there, if the only harmonics present in the ah area, right? So if we only have ah harmonics, even though it's the missing fundamental is in the oo, we're going to be hearing that ah color. Let's look at what that sounds like. Okay, so here's our multiple missing fundamental. I've got this set to have 8 harmonics, and so I'm going to have it play, and it's going to sound like an oo. Definitely an oo. If I take away, so within this, sorry, before I take away anything, within this harmonic series, there's also another harmonic series, right? So this pitch is starting on F right here. I can change this and show you there. It's starting on F, then we get F, C, F, A, C, E, etc., right? But what that also means is that we've got another set of harmonics. This F, and this C are also contained within that, right? So 2, 4, and 6 are their own set of harmonics that will have their own version of the missing fundamental. So when I've got all these harmonics in here, we hear the oo. But when I take away those ones and have the other harmonics, we're going to have a different tone color. So remember, that's this F right here. And if I go even further, taking out the bottom one, we're getting more towards ah now. So that's where we go with the missing fundamentals. It's important to remember that we need to be able to resolve those harmonics in order to pick them up. So we really only get about 8 harmonics. If we're talking about the infinite amount that the human voice uses, a lot of those go into areas of roughness created by our critical bands that we're not able to resolve them in our ear, and then we do not get vowel colors from those. So we only get vowel colors from about the first 8. All right. Next is local spectral coherence. So this is, I write, if multiple harmonics span multiple tone colors, they adapt the average tone color, referred to as the spectral centroid. So basically think if you have 3, you have harmonic 3, 4, and 5. If you play them all together at the same time at the same intensity, harmonic 4 is going to be the mean in the middle, right? So we're going to hear harmonic 4 as the dominant spectral tone color of what's happening right there. That's the spectral centroid. It's the center of that, what we hear. When we talk about these, we use the less than symbol, so we hear less than O or less than oo, whereas we use the approximate symbol for the absolute spectral tone colors, and we just use that to sort of differentiate complex waves versus sine waves. So let's listen to how this works. I've got that math equation down there if you really want to look at it, but I know how much you all love math. Okay, so we're actually going to do this in Voce Vista. And we've got our 3 harmonics here from our previous generated sound. And so what we're going to do now is I'm going to create frequency filters for each of the harmonics so that we can independently control their volume. So right now they're all equal, and we see that we've got O is going to be where this guy is falling right there. So we're going to hear an O sound when we play all of them together. If we change the spectral centroid by um, increasing the bottom one and lowering the one on the right, that's going to shift that spectral centroid to the left, and it'll be now about 450 hertz. And it's going to be much more predominantly oo than it was before. And remember, I've got these marked down here, and so if you want to look, that center is going to be right here at 450. If I change it again, and instead I make the one on the left, or on the right, the strongest, we're going to adjust that feeling more up towards the aw sound. Definitely aw, changing back to oo. So that's what the spectral centroid is changing what the composite of those harmonics spectral tone color is, depending upon what their amplitudes are. Okay, weak tone color bridging. So weak tone color bridging occurs when you have two harmonics and they create a tone color that's in the middle of them. So not one or the other, but in the middle. So for instance, if we have three harmonics where there's an oo, o, and an ah, and then we take out the harmonic that is oo sound or o sounding. So we're going to take out the middle harmonic, the o sounding harmonic. That oo harmonic and the ah harmonic will both bridge weakly to create a sort of phantom spectral centroid that will sound like an O. And it will be very different sounding than if the O was in there. It'll sound less robust and a little bit more sterile. But we'll definitely get an O nonetheless. And so we want to remember that we can really equate this to mixing colors together. So if we have one color mixed with another, we're going to get the color that's in the middle. So we're going to do the same thing with the vowel colors here. So let's look at this in Voce Vista. So I've got another sound. I've got to remember where that. Okay. So I've got an oo harmonic. I've got an ah o harmonic. And I should have another one somewhere too. I still got, they're all messed up with their levels. I've gotten two there. I don't want those two. And we're going to have that ah harmonic there. So let's make sure we get all of the harmonic in it. So here are three harmonics we're going to be looking at. And we'll hear that difference if we get rid of the one in the middle. So we've got this tone color. Sounds very open O, ah, o-ish, right? And that's where it falls right here in the middle. Now if we get rid of that one, we'll have a phantom color of the same one, but it won't quite sound the same. You'll also hear it sound like it jumps up the octave, because this is now an octave between 500 and 1000, and so our ears hear those harmonics as having this as the fundamental. Even though we have that other color in the middle. All right. So, I think that's really cool. Now we got to talk about the absolute true fundamental, or the obvious true fundamental. Sorry, wrong word. Absolute obvious. There's so many of these definite words, so we're not quite sure what they are. Okay, so the obvious true fundamental is when the fundamental pitch is so strong that it dominates the spectral tone color. Okay, and this happens a lot on high treble voice singing. So when the high tone sung tone is really really high, it's going to have a higher amplitude and it's going to dominate the tone color of the vowel and the vowel percept. So that's why when we're up high in our treble ranges, we go from O to A to Ah, because that's exactly where that happens, where that dominant true fundamental is going to have those tone colors. So we can't sing anything but those vowel sounds there. And so teachers teach that differently, right? So they're going to talk to you about a taller vowel. They're not necessarily going to use an O or an A. That's just the language we're using to talk about it right now. But it definitely has that sort of timbral change to it. And I think that we can all agree that that happens, and what the terminology is really dependent on who you're talking to and like what your goals are in terms of that. And that's what we call F2D tuning. Because once we get rid of the other harmonics aren't as strong, we're really just riding that first harmonic, and that's where we're getting our vowel tone color from. And we'll talk about that more once we start talking about active vowel modification in the next sections. Okay, so those four things together create the total vowel percept. And so the final perceived vowel is a composite of all of these different tone colors from the different spectral peaks, right? So we get the peaks that happen in the curve of the spectrum that then have their own tone colors, their own composite tone colors, that then weigh into the larger total vowel percept. And so we've got a graph of these over here on the right. And it's important to note that this arrow right here denotes where we stop resolving the harmonics because of the critical bandwidths. Okay, so all of the harmonics above this arrow are unresolved and rough. Okay, whereas later on you'll see that that arrow moves. So essentially we can call this section oo because all of those harmonics resolve into an oo sound. This one is an o sound, and that's what ends up dominating in the middle. And this one is an ah sound, and then we get very rough and unresolved over here. So now we're going to look at the same thing, but we're going to look at it as we increase the sun pitch by an octave. And as you remember in my presentation last time, when you do that, you get less resolution in where the resonances are in the vocal tract, right? You get a different sort of curve that happens. The filter has a different shape. So the same thing's going to happen here, but because of that, the percept of the vowel, or what we're hearing as the sun vowel, is going to change because we don't have the same sort of harmonic energy filling up those spectral peaks. So at different points, they're going to switch over tone colors, which would be at a different point than we would expect, right? So here, when we sing B2, and we still have this arrow that indicates where we get unresolved frequencies above that, we're going to hear this dark ah as a mix between oo and o, and there's definitely a lot of ah energy there. When we raise that up an octave, this o sort of sound becomes much more powerful than the other stuff around it. And as we raise that even further, we get this other sort of percept that happens in the middle. And so you can see that we lose that sort of resolution and the power that those different spectral peaks have when we change what's happening underneath. And that doesn't mean that it's worse or better. It just means that it changes what we perceive as the sun vowel. Okay. I think this all is really fascinating because it really helps us to explain what vowels are and how we use them in our singing. A lot of times, coaches and conductors and voice teachers think about them as just IPA symbols that need to be oo, e, and there's this very specific sort of vowel shape that you need to use when you're singing it. There's actually this great book about Caruso where they use his faces as like a pedagogy tool where they have like pictures of like what is like the perfect E vowel and what's the perfect O vowel. But all of this is super dependent on like what pitch you're singing because the harmonics interact with the resonances in different places and whatever. We were actually going to look at that in class, but we're not going to get to because we got to get through this stuff a little bit more quickly. So you can't tell what a vowel is just by a shape. You can't make a shape, put sound through it, and the vowel is going to be the right way. We're going to perceive it differently depending upon what pitch it's on and what is around it, what we've heard before, what somebody's voice sounds like compared to somebody else's voice. Everything changes depending upon what we're doing. So there's no true vowel colors. They're all composites of something else. Okay. So then this slide is really interesting because we can say that there are vowel colors in the other vowels, right? So particularly this E and this U have the same fundamental resonance, the same first resonance around 250 hertz, right? E and U share that. If we look on this graph over here, E and U are right about in the same position. So in that sense, if we look at it up and down this way, and what we're trying to balance as the spectral centroid, perhaps over the in total vowel percept, because there are two peaks up on top here, we're going to hear this vowel as E because it's much more heavily weighted towards the top than if it were towards the bottom. Whereas U has this strong resonance frequency down low, along with this one, and it's weighted towards the lower side, and we're definitely going to hear that as U. Additionally, what that means is that this U resonance within the E vowel is actually where the darkness comes from. So that dark sound on the low side of the spectrum, this strong low resonance frequency is where our richness and our warmth is going to come from in an E vowel. And the same thing when we sing that U. The same thing can be said between A and O. Over here on the top right, our A and our O vowels share a lot of the first resonance frequencies. So our A is just a little bit tilted to the higher frequency side, whereas our O is tilted towards the lower frequency side. And finally, Ah has its own sort of colors between dark Ah, darker Ah, or bright Ah, and then Ah. We get all of 4 of those colors happening right there. And that's changes in the second resonance frequency, right? Remember I said that the absolute spectral tone colors sort of follow the second resonance frequency, right? And we can see that here. The second resonance frequency is the lines in the middle. And we go E, A, O, U going down, or U, O, I, E. And that's the same order as it is for the absolute spectral tone colors. All right. So, what can this explain? This explains what a vowel is, right? It's the perception and the way that the resonances interact with the harmonics in our vocal tracts, and then how we perceive that on our side of things. Then going the step further, if we're going to start talking about how this affects pedagogy, we can talk about how soprano high notes change vowel colors because of the obvious true fundamental. We can talk about changes in timbral color in the passaggio with male voices. You know, they're kind of, as soon as they hit their passaggio, their upper harmonics start to become resolved rather than rough, and that's a big aspect of it. And then we also change the spectral centroid to some of those harmonic peaks, and so we change sort of vowel colors as we go through that. And then we can also talk about how active vowel modification achieves maximum resonance. So the whole like Pavarotti changing his vowels, singing the B, high B in Celeste Aida. We're going to look at that a little bit in the coming slides. All right, thank you so much.